There
Okay,
he is.
looks like we're good.
There he is. I was just looking for you, Steve.
Well, I was in, but it didn't show me anything, and I went to the discussion board to just ask if I was in the right place.
Got it. Well, technology is great when it works, but I'm absolutely delighted. Uh, we need to catch up, Steve. It's been a long time, but Steve Hargadon is one of the leading voices in, I would say, the alternative education world. And he probably knows more than just about anybody about this world. I've known him for many years. His website is one of the most incredible resources on earth for information about new ways to think about learning. Um, and other than that, I can't wait to hear what he says about parenting 2.0. So take it away.
Terrific. I'm going to share my screen. Let's make sure that works. Okay. Are you seeing it okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I'll get my notes up. So this is Parenting 2.0. And the reason I'm calling it Parenting 2.0 is because the 2.0 phrase indicates doing something at a higher level. I mean, Web 2.0 was sort of the first really substantial cultural use of that phrase, Web 2.0, and it meant the use of websites that user data rather than created data by the website creator, and it represented this sort of leap. And Parenting 2.0 for me is kind of looking at parenting beyond the immediate day-to-day kind of emergencies and issues. And I want to talk quickly before we start talking about the parenting, about where I think change really takes place. Michael and I have gone back some distance on this conversation about education reform. I did an interview series with over 300 education thinkers called The Future of Education. And I came to the conclusion that I don't believe in education reform. I don't actually think that the education system can be reformed because I think it's actually doing what it's designed to do. Now, designed in kind of a larger use of that phrase, I know a lot of people are in education. They're very thoughtful and caring, but in large part, since Plato's Republic and even further back, school systems are designed to inculcate people into a culture. And I think our system does exactly what it's designed to do. And having participated in conversations about education reform for decades now, and seeing people get really excited about ideas and changing things, I was curious as to why things didn't actually change, and why really good schools that were created didn't perpetuate or didn't become like seeds for other schools. And I love the optimism of the entrepreneurial activity and really want it to take place. But I also think we have to be realistic about how we fix the education system if it can be fixed. And Illich talked about institutions perpetuating the problems they were designed to solve, and I think schooling falls into that category. One of the questions that I like to ask is, what percentage of students graduate from high school as competent adults? And when I ask this question, I often get a recognition response. That's an involuntary kind of intake of breath, or a gasp, or a laugh. And generally, people will say that maybe 5% of high school students graduate as competent adults. And my question has always been, okay, so why? Why would we have such a small number of students capable of starting a family, living on their own, making a living? And so what is school actually really doing? And we through Learning Revolution, I run a 5-week parenting for academic success course that really focuses on, how you would create a culture in your family for academic success. I like to talk a lot about student success, which I think is more than just academic success. It's kind of the sense of capacity and capability, this being an agent in the world. And then for tonight's purposes, I wanted to talk about life success, which is not just getting through school, but using the experience of school, homeschool, public school, chartered school, private school, to springboard into thinking about life success. And the first exercise I would propose that you might consider doing would be to write on a sheet of paper, what is success? You don't need to stress about it. I would do free form writing. I would sort of free journaling, but write down all the things that you think success actually consists of. And intriguingly, I think we have innate capacity to define success in ways that are very similar. If we sat in a room together and we talked about this, we would probably come up with a very similar list. And in a lot of ways, that list would reflect things that are not kind of normally measured. So it would be happiness, being a good friend, being healthy, a variety of things that would not fall into academic or financial categories if we talked about success. But I think as a parent, that would be a really good list for you to have. What do you think success is? Because that then becomes the measure of what you're trying to accomplish as a parent. So, you could do the same thing for academic success. I do this with teachers all the time. I call it the conditions of learning. What is learning success and how do you create the conditions for it? You could talk about student success and you can talk about life success. And I would suggest that you actually do these exercises with your children, that you could sit down and say, what is success in life and how do we define it? And then that gives us sort of a framework for thinking about how we would move forward. When I talk about school to teachers, and I'll say, what is the preeminent influence on a student's academic success? They will almost always say the family, literally 99 times out of 100. And I've wondered if they say that because they feel like the family is the primary influence, so they can't fix things that the family has broken, which I think sometimes they actually believe. But I also think that they recognize sort of deeply that the culture of a family really defines how students approach academic pursuits. I'll get into this a little bit, but there is a very interesting way in which the family's response and reactions, the mental models that we have, the culture that we have in our families, becomes our children's culture and the way they think about their life, their thinking patterns. And those are so incredibly valuable. So if your thinking pattern is how you get work done, how you get things done on time, how you make friends with teachers, you have a huge step up on a child who's in a family where they don't know how to do that or there are some other dysfunctions. Okay, so here's a quick outline for the day, for the next 15 minutes. It's not your dog, your school story, creating the conditions and building a school plan together. So let's talk about it's not your dog. So I got this phrase from The Dog Whisperer and Cesar Millan, and you probably have seen the show where people are having a problem with their dog, and they call Cesar Millan to come help them. And it's so funny to me because you know what he's going to say. Like, why would you call him? Because he'll come and he's going to work with you on your. He's going to look and see what's happening, what's going on with your dog, and it's never actually the dog. The problem is with the dog owners, and so it's a really helpful way to remember that we sometimes want to attribute our difficulties to our children, but they actually are things that we have to work on ourselves. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So the second exercise I would suggest that you do would be to take another sheet of paper and write down your school story. What's your story of school for you? Were you a good student? Were you a struggling student? Did you love school? Did you hate school? Do that. And if you have a parenting partner, do that with a parenting partner. And then think about what your parents' school stories were, and maybe even your grandparents' school stories. And it's a helpful way of remembering that we actually have stories about school. So school, for some people, can be this magical, wonderful door-opening experience, and for others, it can be really hard. And it's helpful to know that we create stories from the data points of our lives, but we could also create new stories, and identifying that we have a story helps us to do that. Okay, so then maybe ask yourself what your child's school story is. And one of the ways that I've done this with my children and with others is to say to the students, if you could reinvent school, what would you do? And it's actually really fun to have them answer that question. So, and if you can, just listen, see what they say, and then kind of take into to your listening what does that tell you about how they're perceiving school and what their mental models are for school? Okay, so sorry, I skipped a slide there. So creating conditions. The analogy of planting and then cultivating, watering, taking care of something, and then having it grow to fruition is a really good one for parenting. And it's one that requires that we kind of think about longer time frames and we think about what we're accomplishing. And I think sometimes we want the outcome so badly that we forget that there's a task of creating the conditions for the outcome. So if you think about this, question of life success, you'd say to yourself and your parenting partner or whomever you're doing this exercise with, okay, if these are the things that we think of as being success, what conditions would we have to create to help those take place? And that's sort of parenting 2.0. That's taking your parenting to a different level. And it's saying, well, if we think success is being a good friend, being helpful, feeling confident, what are the conditions that lead to that? Like one of the things I think we often do is we want kids to feel confident. And for me, as a parent, I discovered that the condition for confidence was competence. So if I want my child to feel confident, I need to help them become competent in something. And that was really a big thing for me. You're passing along in this process kind of a mental narrative or mental models for how you accomplish something. And doing that as transparently as possible, what I would call generative parenting, where you're sort of transparent with your kids as they get older about the actual act of parenting, can really make a difference for them in sort of understanding their own capacity to think through what they're doing. The next thing I want you to consider is to build a school plan together. It's always stunning to me to hear that there's an IEP program for students that the students aren't actively a part of or even leading. So it's like, okay, our kids, we would hope, if success for our children is becoming capable of managing their own affairs and managing their own learning, then we would want to involve them as early as possible in that process. Robert Epstein wrote a wonderful book called Teen 2.0, where he described that in most cultures at age 11 or 12, people become adults. And so this idea of, in our culture, maybe adulthood doesn't happen until mid-20s in some cases, later. I mean, I don't want to make too big a point of that, but we want our kids at sort of an early age to feel some sense of that the education is actually theirs. And this is where this sort of interesting thing that takes place, which is sometimes, again, with this outcome, we want it so badly that we will force it. We'll try and force it. For me, that was a case. There were two places where that happened. One was when I didn't have much time, where I needed to put some time into something. And because I didn't have the time with the child, I wanted to enforce it or mandate it. And the other is that I was the best parent where I was confident of the things that I was faced with. So if it was a problem, I knew how to solve it. I knew how to help the child solve the problem. When it was a part of my life that I wasn't super confident in, I actually went to command and control. And so it's really helpful to think about, okay, if we build a school plan together, I'm going to help you identify the areas where I struggled, help you identify areas where you might struggle, and then say, what do you want to accomplish in the next 4 years in high school? And then what would you like to accomplish in college? And this plan's going to change. We'll get it out every year and we'll go through it and talk about it. But more and more, I'm going to put you in charge of your own education. And not wanting, again, that's a huge time issue. And sometimes it's a confidence issue. We may not have the time and we may not also have the confidence that if I don't feel like I could have made good decisions, do I feel like my child can make good decisions? Okay, so that puts us in the role of partner or coach with our child. And I think that's a really good way to kind of finish thinking about this. When we are partnering or coaching with a child, school is actually a game. I've talked to students about this. I gave a talk at Google headquarters as part of a conference on schools and said, this top percentage of kids who feel like they're good learners, or the small few. And these students came up to me afterwards and they said, we're interns at Google. We're in that top group, but we didn't think we were good learners. We were good at the game of school. And there are kind of rules to that game. I'm going to talk about this Thursday night, but there are ways to approach schooling, and making a plan allows you to actually work outside of those rules. right? So if a student wants to learn, to be a beekeeper, or there are other things, you kind of figure that out outside of the traditional offerings, and you realize that school is just a part of that larger plan. And I'm your partner or coach to help you kind of become an adult and take responsibility for your own life. So with that, because I believe in things ending on time, we've got about 10 minutes now, I think, for Q&A. And I don't know if I'm in charge of that, but I'm glad to be.
I can certainly support you. If there are no questions, I can ask you questions, Steve.
Oh, feel free. So Laura wants to know, have I practiced this personally? Okay, this is a really good question, Laura. You'd have to ask my children. But so along with this phrase generative parenting, which I know I didn't invent, but it's really stuck with me, this idea that I'm parenting kind of in an open way with my kids, I have felt like the test of my parenting was my grandchildren. So, and it's the conversations I have with my grown kids about parenting now that feel like they're the most valuable. And we didn't homeschool per se. We did what we called independent schooling, which is every year we looked at the circumstances of our children and what was going on, and we worked with them to pick a pathway that made sense for them. So one daughter started a Shakespeare troupe and actually completely dropped out of public school and joined a homeschooling group. Another took a gap year. One struggled a little, and we went from school to school and to different things. And then our last child said, I'm not doing any of that crazy stuff. I want a school. I want a locker. I want to be on the soccer team. I want a best friend. And we're like, okay, this is your game. You play it. And it's so fun to watch her because she's flourishing. She's now becoming a school teacher. I'm delighted for her. It's not how I necessarily worked, but it worked for her.
Other questions?
Good for you, Laura.
So I'm always interested, Steve. Good to know. I'm always interested, Steve, in how, so I completely, absolutely agree with your perspective. I'm interested in how we can spread it more quickly. I think we're both kind of frustrated at the pace of change. So how can we spread it more quickly?
So I feel like there's a fallacy there, not personal for you or for me, but I think there's a trap for all of us, which is we try and scale. We want to scale. And because of that, we're not actually acting as authentically as we might. So in a lot of ways, the trap for me was I really felt like, okay, I'm going to do all these interviews and we're going to change education. And it didn't change. And I was like, okay, what's really going on? And then I thought, well, how does change actually take place? Right? So a good possible comparison would be the food revolution. Right? So over the course of time, people have become much more aware of food and the quality of food and GMO food and pesticides and herbicides and antibiotics. And kind of on a one-to-one basis, people talk to each other, and there's been a growing movement. But it hasn't become the thing, right? So Whole Foods hasn't displaced all the other grocery stores, but it becomes a significant minority with integrity. And so I think my feeling has been I've changed my scope. It's more like, okay, let's create that good alternative that's solid and authentic, and then realize this school system thing is very pervasive and very powerful. And it goes back to Plato's Republic. It goes throughout history, this idea of how you inculcate people. Look up Plato's Noble Lie to see that, the sort of the conception of how you categorize students and the importance of that categorization for your society to function well. And once you realize sort of the pervasive deep roots of conforming compliant schooling, at least for me, I found, okay, I'm not going to actually change that system. I'm just going to try and do a really good job of speaking openly and thoughtfully about it. And you look at someone like Carrie, who's been doing this for so long, but my guess is the ripple influence from her has been substantial. And so I guess that would be my sort of conclusion is I've stopped wanting it to scale or be bigger. and been more like, okay, I'm just going to have good conversations with people, because it's like talking about, this is going to be really interesting. It's like talking about the news. Like if you think about George Orwell, the actual writer, Eric Blair, the reports that he wrote as a wartime correspondent, and how he recognized that almost nothing that was in the news was actually accurate or could be. Think about how profoundly he's influenced so many of us through his book 1984, right? And so it's like there are all of these institutions, they all have stories, and the internet kind of broke all of those stories. So there's some of us who are just trying to be helpful, to say, okay, I'm seeing things differently, and let's try and talk about that and record it, so that over the course of time, more and more people begin to see how those stories aren't necessarily true.
Fair enough. And then the optimist in me wants to say, and as more and more of us bear witness in this manner, there will be a tipping point. But maybe that's wishful thinking, or I should give
Well,
it up.
no. I mean, what do banks do, Michael? So what's the story of banking? That it helps you to become financially secure and keep your money safe. What do banks actually do? They make
They
a
use,
profit.
yeah, and they use all sorts of ways to preserve that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you could look at all of our institutional industries: banking, food, the defense industry, defense war industry, pharmaceutical. We would probably say, in our honest moments, there's such a force of profit and power and control within those institutions that changing them is less realistic than I would want it to be. So I love what you said. I just don't know that there will actually be a tipping point. I mean, I think the reason that modern public schooling is so pervasive is that it's so good at what it does, right? I mean, it suits all of these other institutional interests. We don't feel good about ourselves, so we buy things that we don't really need, and we part of the consumer culture. So until there's some sort of a collapse, and maybe the fourth turning would communicate to us that there will be some form of a collapse, I don't think there will be a tipping point. I think the system is going to stay the system, in the same way that I don't think banks are going to change. I don't think the pharmaceutical industry is going to change. I think we change, and then we share it with those around us as best we can.
Fair enough. Just because I talk to parents and I've seen individual parents change, yeah, then I go back to the one to scale. Like I've seen people completely shift paradigms, and it's like it happens. It can happen, uh, but it's tricky. It's tricky. The forces of inertia are immense, and self-interest for sure.
Yeah, and Michael, I love what you're doing, right? And I'm, when the pandemic started, I held a massive conference called the Home Learning Summit, and I really thought it was going to be this huge deal. And I can tell you, because you'll empathize, there was so little participation. I mean, I have a mailing list of 150,000, and I think maybe 2,000 people signed up, and I was so discouraged. And I had to go through this process of, okay, so what's actually going on here? Well, if my message really resonated with everybody, then it would be a message of the current cultural system. So that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's just what we're doing here, making good friends, trying to speak honestly and carefully about what's taking place, and then hoping that, at some point in time, somebody says, oh, I'm so grateful that Michael held that conference.
Well, thank you, and I'm grateful you joined us. You've got 3 minutes. What any last messages for our audience in your remaining 3 minutes?
I don't think so. I certainly appreciate that you've come to an event like this, and that you're interested in making changes. And I think our children deserve better. And hopefully you can help that be the case in your own family and for those around you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, well, thanks for everybody. We got a 15-minute break, and after the 15-minute break, we have Matt Boudreau for our second keynote uh, at 1:30.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.